eu gostaria de apresentar rapidamente a professora Emma Crewe e agradecê-la por ter aceitado nosso convite. I would introduce you and thank you for accepting our invitation and being here with us today. A professora Emma é antropóloga de formação e é professora da Escola de Estudos Orientais e Africanos da Universidade de Londres, a SOAS. Há muito tempo, ela estuda os parlamentos, ela tem um longo trabalho de pesquisa no Parlamento Britânico, em Westminster, nas duas casas, na Casa dos Comuns e na Casa dos Lordes, e tem vários livros publicados já, tanto sobre a Casa dos Comuns como sobre a Casa dos Lordes, uns 4 ou 5 livros já que ela, nesses 20 anos, já publicou sobre esse assunto. Ela também é especialista em desenvolvimento internacional, trabalhou muito tempo com organizações não governamentais em diferentes países. E, atualmente, ela é a coordenadora internacional da pesquisa, de uma pesquisa global comparada, que trata de etnografias de 6 parlamentos, em 6 diferentes países, da qual eu faço parte aqui no Brasil. Então, nós estamos estudando Brasil, Etiópia, Fiji, Reino Unido, Estados Unidos e Índia, nesse momento. Estamos fazendo um filme sobre a Câmara dos Deputados no Brasil, também sobre os vereadores da cidade de Sheffield, no Reino Unido, e também sobre os parlamentares da Etiópia, que, nesse momento, vive uma guerra civil, então é uma situação bastante delicada. Nós estamos fazendo um filme sobre a Etiópia também. Só para dar um breve relato para vocês, né, de quem é a professora Emma e, a partir de que ponto de vista ela vai conversar com a gente. Tá bom? Depois que ela falar, a professora Carla e a professora Telma vão fazer suas considerações, e aí a gente vai abrir para as perguntas da audiência. Ok? Okay, I have introduced you, so I talk a lot of good things about you, but you have just to trust me, mainly. And now you have the time you need for your presentation, and after that we are doing some debate with our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me easily? Thank you so much, Cristiane, for inviting me. Thank you for being the most brilliant colleague as well. I'm really delighted to be here after nearly 3 weeks of trying to understand Brazilian politics. I would need another 10 years, so I'm not going to try and talk about Brazil today. I'm going to talk about my own research to try and give a flavor of what it's like to be an anthropologist studying parliaments. So that's what I'm going to do today. And I thought I would start. I hope my anthropologist colleagues don't disagree with me, or if they do so in a way that we can have a good debate. But I'm going to give you my take on anthropology. So I'm really impressed by the way Tim Ingold, who's a UK anthropologist, he's actually in University of Aberdeen, so I guess he's a Scot. So the way he describes anthropology is really interesting because he conveys it as a process that is always highly participatory. You in a way, you can't keep too much distance from the people that you're studying with. They're not objects, they're people that you're studying with. So that's why he calls anthropology a form of philosophy, but with the people still in. So we're always grounded because we're always studying with people. We're not really interested in the form of kind of theoretical explanations or abstractions that take you too far away from what actual people are doing in real life. And I take that kind of approach into parliaments. But he also, I like the way he describes it as a kind of form of inquiry that's a bit like a hunt, or I think of us as almost like detectives. So he describes anthropologists follow their noses, sniffing out promising sources and lines of inquiry. They are like hunters on the trail. To hunt, you have to dream the animal, get under its skin to perceive as it does, know it from the inside out. So you're really trying to understand how people think and how they are, in contrast to how other people are. So you're always thinking about similarities and differences between people. And it changes you. So that's what's really exciting about doing anthropology for me, that I think the assumption that we have is that you will not be the same, that the constant process of inquiry means that you become someone different. And sometimes your informants do as well. In fact, when I was studying the Westminster politicians, some of them did describe it as therapy. So their lives are so fraught, so hectic, so chaotic, and sometimes so painful that I actually realized after sometimes 3 or 4 hours of interviewing a politician that it was tipping over into something which felt a little bit like a kind of mutual form of therapy. So I'd say, oh, wait, hang on, I'm not actually a qualified therapist. So it's a discipline where you study very much with people. You're really trying to understand what they are thinking, what they're doing, but not just as individuals. The emphasis of anthropology is very much to understand how people relate to each other. It's about relationships. Relationships are at the core. And if I've got one kind of key message, somebody was challenging me over lunch, that academics are not always very good at trying to simplify their findings. But if I have a kind of simple finding, it's that when you're talking about the work of politicians, and I'm talking about when they are failing to be ethical or aspire to standards, then what's often missing in the understanding is the relational aspects of the moral life of politicians, if you like. So I'm just going to very, very quickly introduce you to the kind of 20 years or so of studying parliaments that followed a career actually in international development. So to try and create some false coherence in my work, I guess I study organizations that are aspiring to do public good. So I used to study international NGOs, but for the last 20 years I've been studying parliaments, mostly the Westminster Parliament. So I started with the House of Lords, very easy, relatively speaking, because it's small, they're there for life, it's like a village. They're not very ambitious, they have plenty of time to talk to you as a researcher. So it has the kind of intensity and intimacy of a village in contrast to the House of Commons, which is where the power is. So it's different from Brazil because the House of Commons, certainly anyway by convention, is overwhelmingly where the power is. And it's therefore fraught. People are incredibly ambitious. It's chaotic. I lived in a state of constant anxiety about whether or not I was in the right place. Where is the action happening? So I found gatekeepers, I found journalists, I found key people who really knew where the action was. That was the most important thing, methodologically probably, in studying the Commons. But the other kind of work I've been doing is to get into coalitions and collaborations with people in other countries. So I'm really particularly keen to try and create opportunities in countries where people struggle to get research funding. So I've been raising kind of large grants since about 2014. First of all in Bangladesh and Ethiopia, then in Ethiopia and Myanmar, and now Cristiane and I are working in 6 countries. And the purpose is to try and enable comparative studies, not just between countries in Europe or Europe and North America, which get a lot of funding to do studies of legislatures and parliaments, but also studies in the global south, because there are all kinds of really fascinating comparisons you can make about the role of social media or what politicians are doing in their constituencies, or the tensions between different groups of politicians, or the role of political parties. There are all kinds of things which are interesting to compare between countries in the global north and global south, or within those vast regions. So my challenge to colleagues in Europe and North America is be a bit more worldly you're ignoring whole areas of the world without a good logic. So that's why I'm really excited to work in coalition with scholars across the world. So that's just a little introduction. I want to just set in context now what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today is standards, which in the UK Parliament is kind of a technical sounding way of talking about bad behavior or good behavior. So this is about politicians and ethics. And I want to just quickly explain that this is only a tiny, tiny little part of what I've done in the UK Parliament. So I studied the House of Commons, which is what I'm talking about today, just after the expenses scandal, which I will describe in a minute. So I really intensely studied the House of Commons when there was a new party in government. It was a coalition, 2010, and it was just after the expenses scandal. So the House of Commons, which I'm not going to bore you with all the details of all these activities, but really what I was doing in the House of Commons was kind of watching the aftermath of the expenses scandal. And politicians were so agonized by it that they talked about it, but it was really hard. It was one of the frequent occasions when the research became a kind of form of therapy, because they were really, really shocked by the public fury that was incited by this scandal that happened just before I came. So in the first book that I wrote about the House of Commons, I kind of didn't take too much notice of the expenses scandal. I did a lot of interviews, a lot of observation. I did what I called mini histories in the top right, probably the most powerful way to understand what's going on in the complex world of parliaments which are connected to whole nations, from my point of view, was to do little histories. So one of them, just to give you an example, was following one clause in one bill. So I wanted to understand lawmaking. Lawmaking is really important, obviously, in parliaments, and legal scholars tend to look at huge swathes of legislation if they're asking, for example, who influences lawmaking. And I thought, well, I'm going to do something a bit different. Anthropologists like to go into minute detail because we think often it's in the detail that you find out what's going on. So I followed one clause. It was 250 words for 2 years. And I interacted with all the people who got involved with this one clause that was about children's rights. And to see it unfold really told me a lot about who gets involved in the making of a law. And in fact, although the texts look as if everything happened between the two houses, the reality of the story revealed that civil society had a huge role to play. But I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't have gone into that depth, because texts only show you part of the story. And that's part of what I'm really going to talk about today as well, that you really have to get behind the scenes to find out what's going on. So you have to be both involved, really involved in the detail, but you also have to have some kind of detachment. I like this phrase that Norbert Elias, the sociologist, describes involved detachment as the kind of disposition that you need if you're a sociologist or an anthropologist, if you really want to find out what's going on. You need to look in depth, you need to look behind the scenes, but you also sometimes need to get a bit of detachment. So I'm going to talk about some examples of breaches in standards. Sometimes it's about breaking laws, rules, norms. Sometimes it's actually about following them. But I also want to say something about how anthropologists approach researching complicated issues where there's a huge cast of characters involved. So I want to say something about methodology, but I also want to say something about theory. And I suppose the theoretical disposition that all anthropologists have, which I've already alluded to, is that, yes, we're interested in individuals, and of course politicians are really interesting individuals. They're very exposed. They often have or aspire to have power in relation to others. They're public figures. So yeah, of course the individuals are important in political worlds. And so are the ways in which systems or cultures are created within the whole of Parliament or within groups of politicians and people outside, like political parties. But what's often missing in the study of parliamentary studies is the way that people relate to each other. This is what anthropologists really excel at. We really like to get into trying to understand the relationships between people, the alliances and the divisions and the ways that people create reciprocal kinds of exchanges, the loyalty, the disloyalty, the ways in which people relate. So that's the kind of thing that I want to try and get at today. And I won't be able to do so comprehensively, so please do ask me questions, either about this issue of standards or any other aspect of UK politicians' work. So let's just think about standards and good or bad behavior. The two main political science theories on parliamentary studies that I suppose dominate are rational choice theory, which is kind of is long-standing as a theory, but also new institutionalism has had a huge impact, of course, on political science, and within that, rules are clearly massively important, and I don't dispute that. However, I think rules are only part of the story because people don't always follow rules. So when political science look at standards being broken or people behaving badly in the UK Parliament, they tend to look at either the problem as an individual one, so you've got some deficiency, some kind of moral deficiency in individuals, or it's a cultural failure of some kind. And actually, I also teach management at another university, University of Hertfordshire. And I find that this is incredibly prevalent in all organizations, that when people think that others are behaving badly, they tend to endlessly go to these default positions. Oh, that person's a really bad person. Oh, they're just, you know, it's either their political values are wrong or they're just bad character. So it's often the individual that's blamed, or, oh, it's the culture. Okay, we'll have a new code of conduct, we'll change the rules, and then the culture will be fixed. And I guess that's what I'm challenging today. I don't think that's sufficient. That may be part of the picture, but it's not enough. And to understand what I might say is the missing link, which is the relationships, you have to understand history. So this is part of a broader point that I'd like to make. Although I've kind of made a big pitch for anthropology, I'm actually really, really a passionate believer in being interdisciplinary, or even better, multidisciplinary. Bourdieu wrote about how to be a good sociologist, you also have to be a historian. So anthropologists weren't until something like the 1970s. We used to write about societies as if they were kind of frozen in time. And we just ignored history. And I think now no anthropologist does. You cannot do good anthropology without a strong sense of history. And as many other disciplines as possible, but of course, we can't accommodate all the different disciplines, so you have to make difficult choices. So I want to look at a piece of history, a little mini history that relates to the House of Commons. And I did this little piece of research in a really unusual way because I did it with one of the central actors, one of the people who was really involved. And this came about because somebody in the House of Commons who already had read my book, which was about the period just after the expenses scandal. In fact, it was David Nartzler, who was then the clerk of the House in the House of Commons, the most senior official in the House of Commons, said to me, would you do a piece of research with somebody who was actually the person responsible for paying allowances and salaries, etc., to MPs? Would you do this piece of research together? And I thought, no way. That sounds like a totally poisoned chalice. That sounds impossibly difficult. Nobody is going to like whatever we come up with. So initially I just thought, oh, but out of curiosity, I couldn't resist meeting Andrew Walker, who was the former Director of Finance. And I said, what are you thinking? And he said, well, you know, actually this has really been neglected as a story. This hasn't really been written about. And it was a really, really important story in British politics. It had a massive impact. And I said, okay, you're saying this is a story of historical importance. I was beginning to get really drawn in. And I said, yeah, but you were involved. How can you be impartial? You would have to be really, really self-critical. Are you really up for that? Because if you weren't, then I'd have to walk away. And he said, yeah, I trained as an historian. I wouldn't even think of doing this if I wasn't going to make a massive effort to really think hard about including my own role in this. And I thought, well, okay, actually, I've never really believed in this idea, having been very involved in evaluation, that you get automatic impartiality if you're an outsider. I don't think it works like that, because actually, I used to spend a lot of time evaluating projects. And sometimes, if you were an insider, it was more possible to be honest about the flaws in a project than a total stranger coming in who feels they have to be very polite. So then I got interested in how you deal with partiality and impartiality. And I said to him, if you really are ready to be self-critical, and if you're ready for this whole project to collapse if we don't agree that actually what we've come up with is really, really persuasive despite your involvement, then yeah, let's do it. So we did. We spent 2 years interviewing all the people involved in the expenses scandal. We had 3 main challenges. We had a huge volume of data. He was personally involved, working in the House of Commons for something like 20 years. I'd been studying it by that time for many years. So, and we were interviewing, you know, there were 650 MPs, there were a lot of other people involved, parliamentary staff, there was thousands of journalists, there was the whole British public who responded. How on earth were we going to deal with this volume of data? The second problem was that it was a very uneven history, like all history, particularly complex history, which kind of involves a whole nation, if you like. It wasn't even. History doesn't go along in a nice, even way. You have critical moments, I think. I think this is how history works, and actually complexity scientists take this view as well. So how do you know which are the critical events? And the third one I've already mentioned is how we dealt with the problem of partiality, which is always a problem. Everybody always has a partiality in politics. But we were dealing with a particularly acute form of partiality. And in a way, it was manifested by the fact that I would say Andrew Walker and his staff had been treated with a very robust kind of attitude, if I can put it politely, by politicians. So I would say, you know, he'd seen the worst of politicians, whereas I'd seen the best of politicians. I'm a writer. I write about them. They are utterly charming to me because they know I'm going to be writing about them. In fact, when I went to my own politician who I'd been stalking for some time and said, what do you think about my book? He said, I think you were a bit polite about me. So we had this really kind of conflicting partiality. How were we going to deal with that? Okay, the easy solution, which you're very welcome to ask me about later, is we took the collaboration very seriously. We knew we would have very different opinions, so we didn't underestimate the amount of time we needed to negotiate with each other, bringing others in when we needed to really try and work towards an account which was as persuasive and as thorough as possible. That meant being reflexive. It meant thinking very hard about how we were thinking, about our own history. And that was incredibly hard work. So it took years to write this book, which tells a complex story, which I will try and simplify. What happened? Members of Parliament in the House of Commons had their pay set by the equivalent of an official body that decided civil servants' pay. And they kept making recommendations for increases, but it was up to the government, because the government always has a majority in the House of Commons, to decide whether or not effectively to increase MPs' pay. And the party leaders and whips, not only in the government party, but in other parties as well, all agreed, this is not going to look good. We can't award ourselves a pay rise. The public will be cross. What we'll do is we'll compensate, and we'll pay generous pensions, but we'll also try and pay fairly generous allowances, because increasingly MPs were going to their constituencies. So 100 years ago, UK MPs hardly ever went to their constituency. They saw it as a real pain. You know, they would go maybe once a year, the red carpet would come out, there would be a band receiving them at the railway station. It was a big deal, you know, once a year. And it increased and increased until now, most MPs go every single weekend to their constituency. They tend to go there between Thursday and Monday. It depends how far away it is. But of course, to do that, they have to run 2 homes. Really, really expensive. And most people agreed that if you make politics completely unaffordable for people who don't have a second income, that's a massive bias, and you will get overrepresented by better off people and make politics impossible for people who are at more of a disadvantage. So it was agreed that they should have these allowances. Then what happened is the then Labour government introduced the Freedom of Information Act. And this meant that any public information could be requested by members of the public or anyone. What they didn't really think through was that this might include their own expenses. They tried to argue, the politicians, that expenses weren't public information, they were private information, because it revealed things like their home and what they were spending in the supermarket and, you know, personal data. So they tried to use that other piece of legislation about protecting personal information to say this should be exempt. But it failed. This attempt failed. And in a sense, they were caught at a moment in time when politicians hadn't really appreciated how much they were public property. So in a way, there were all kinds of changes going on in society. Some of them were really good, like less deference towards people with power. But some of it was also an expectation that everything should be transparent. And politicians who kind of embody, you know, how they embody in the UK, a territorial area. They're like the kind of symbol of that area. So in a way, they are public. So everything about them, in some contexts for the members of the public, is public. They are public property. They're kind of owned by us. So this idea that their expenses should be private was scandalous to the public, but completely unintelligible to politicians who, of course, inevitably felt that they should have some kind of privacy. How could they tolerate emotionally and psychologically having no personal identity? So they were in denial. I mean, overwhelmingly in denial. Very, very, very few. There were literally, we found 1 or 2 people who were saying, this isn't going to work. This is going to go public. We have got to prepare. But they just didn't prepare. and years went by with the politicians trying to keep all this information in the private domain. We then had the financial crisis, 2008, and people were really feeling the pinch. It was a really, really difficult time, and so the interest in what MPs were spending was accentuated by this financial crisis. And then there was a leak. And this leak happened from inside Parliament, and thousands of pieces of information were leaked to one of the newspapers. And you then had a campaign by the newspapers to reveal the expenses of MPs. And there were 5 politicians who were found guilty of actually fraud. But actually the vast majority who got caught out and were seen as sort of acting immorally were actually following the rules. This is the interesting thing about the expenses scandal, and an aspect of it which the public still don't really know, because of course it wasn't portrayed like that in the newspapers. What fascinated me about the reaction of the public was the biggest fury was not really related to the law or even rule following or rule breaking. It was more the symbolism of the kind of expenditure that people reacted to. So the 2 kinds of expenditure that the public got most angry about were the incredibly extravagant claims. Like, this is a duck house on a pond, which, yeah, why do you need that as a politician? That does look a bit odd. Maybe ducks were somehow soothing the constituents. No, actually, the truth of that claim is that it wasn't actually a claim. And still, you know, if you tell journalists, they're amazed. The truth of it is, it was a politician who thought, I'm not going to go through all my receipts. I don't know exactly what the rules are. I don't know exactly what's allowed, what's not allowed. So he would take a huge bag full of receipts. He'd put it in the House of Commons, and he'd say, you decide for me what is allowable. Whatever happens, I know that my expenditure gets up to the limit. So the amount is the same, but you decide which ones are qualify, and I'll pay the rest. So although he didn't actually claim for this duck house, he was guilty of another sin, in a way, which was a feeling of entitlement, a kind of inappropriate request of those parliamentary staff. Why should they go through all his receipts, really? So it was a kind of entitlement, but the public fury wasn't really about that. It was understandably about the inappropriateness of that kind of extravagance. And some MPs really didn't help the matter by, and this is a quote from one MP down here on the right, yes, I have a very large house, he said, yeah, and, you know, so the expenditure for them, that house, but it was completely legitimate, and the reason you're cross is you're jealous. Well, that wasn't going to play well with the public either. And how do people say things like that? I think what happened was people were in a blind panic. This had never happened before in Britain. It felt like a complete onslaught for the MPs. From their point of view, it was completely out of control, and they were in a state of utter confusion. The other kinds of claims that were interesting and also elicited fury from the public were very ordinary. I mean, they still get a lot of complaints for charging for things like toilet paper. It's a kind of very ordinary expenditure that we all have to make. And people couldn't understand it. You know, our politicians claiming for things like a bath plug. They didn't really understand about how the political work of MPs had changed. They needed 2 offices, they needed 2 homes. They do have a rather unusual kind of job, MPs. So these very ordinary household items were completely mystifying to the public. And what happened next revealed how the insiders in Parliament, but also the observers and the journalists and people who then were worrying about how to recover the situation, thought about the whole unravelling of the expenses scandal. The solutions reveal how people diagnosed the problem. First of all, it was considered an individual problem. So the MPs as individuals paid back their claims. And in the case of 4, they went to prison. But the other assumption was that it was a cultural problem or an institutional problem. And so they created something called the Independent Standards the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which completely took it out of their hands. And the advantage of that is the whole system is now transparent. The disadvantage is that journalists still look at expenditure of MPs, things like toilet paper, and they attack them continually, even though actually they're completely legitimate claims for expenditure for their constituency office. And it plays into this narrative about all MPs being dishonest, which is simply not true, although it's partially true, which I will come on to in a moment. So, who is dishonest amongst MPs? I'm going to try and argue that we're still living with the expenses scandal, the impact of the expenses scandal, and we're still unable to diagnose breaches of standards, in my opinion, because we're still blaming individuals or systems and cultures, and we're not understanding that morality is partly created by relationships, or in a way, relationships that are not working. So my final section is about why Boris Johnson, our outgoing Prime Minister who was just replaced yesterday, why he continually broke laws, rules, and norms, and then lied about lying, and seemingly got away with it for so long. And I think it actually can only be understood if you look historically at what happened, all the way back to the expenses scandal, and trace kind of British political history since then. So, after the expenses scandal, politicians were terrified of the public. The kind of concern, sometimes obsession, with how things play with the public, as they call it in the UK, was amplified after the expenses scandal, and in a way it's never gone back down. So the anxiety about how things will look to the public, particularly before elections, has got, in a way I would argue, out of control, but it's also been accompanied by an increased sort of professional spinning and manipulation of political messages, made more complicated by the confusion caused by social media. And an example of taking advantage of this new state of affairs, I would trace back to Brexit. So Boris Johnson and other political allies exploited divisions within the Conservative Party, despair at, by that time, maybe 8 years of austerity. So after the financial crisis of 2008, we had austerity ever since then, but at a much greater kind of level once the Conservatives got in. And you had other things like a kind of nostalgia for a time when UK had global significance. All this was taken advantage of with some very, very powerful slogans about taking back control, getting away from more politicians, because politicians do things like overclaim their expenses. And that's why I would argue that they won the referendum. And they then very cleverly treated the referendum as if it was an election. It was actually just advisory, but it was treated as if it was the will of the people, because the people are pretty alarming and frightening and need to be pleased. And so Brexit happened without any assessment of the potential impact on Britain, Europe, the world. What was interesting is that because they won the referendum, Boris and his allies, and because he treated it as an election, he had to become prime minister. It was as if he'd won a general election, and the only logical way that Brexit could be done was if Boris was in control. So he became prime minister, and he repeatedly did deals which favoured his friends, broke the law. For example, he tried to prorogue Parliament when it was illegal. He broke all kinds of rules. But what was interesting is that the public seemed to continually tolerate it until COVID. And once there were two things that happened that became very difficult with the public, but completely unbearable and intolerable to his own party. And one of them was having parties during COVID, when other people had taken terrible, terrible toll, made appalling sacrifices. And it was a kind of breach of that reciprocal agreement that he was asking us to sign up to, when he would be daily on television saying, you know, you have to be locked down. But then we subsequently discovered that he was having parties in number 10. But the other problem was that he would lie and then pretend he wasn't lying, but get other politicians involved in that process. And that became intolerable to them because, again, he was breaking the kind of reciprocal agreement that, you know, the kind of honor among politicians is that you do things for each other, but you do not embroil other politicians in something like a really serious breach of standards or lying, which is going to really hurt their reputation and make them look really bad. So that's what broke him in a way. And I think my point here, and I'm going to wrap up very, very soon and give colleagues a chance to respond and you to ask questions. My point here is that ethics and standards are not just about individuals behaving well or badly. Political worlds are created by people making alliances, being in enmity with each other, and continually struggling to try and win support from new allies. Politics is about friends and foes. It is about relationships. That's how politics is made. And in a way, the whole issue of ethics and standards is no different from that. Behaving well and badly in a political world is inherently going to be political. So it was interesting hearing what his own politicians said about the period just before he resigned. One said, "It is utterly depressing to be asked to defend the indefensible, each time part of us withers." So in that relationship between him and other members of his party, what he was doing fundamentally affected the relationship with others, but how they then felt about themselves. Another said, "This level of transgression and this level of demand for forgiveness requires more than an apology in order to draw a line under it." In a way, the lying about lying was a betrayal. That's not how you do politics between friends. But it was also his former chief of staff who was actually the one who was leaking all these stories to the journalists. So another important aspect to understand about standards and allegations of wrongdoing, I think in any political world, but certainly in the UK, is that the journalists don't have funding to do investigations anymore. Investigative journalism is really, really struggling because the press is struggling economically to survive. So they really rely on leakers. They really rely on people leaking to journalists. Who leaks? Of course your opponents leak, but they don't normally have the most damaging information. It's your friends who have the most damaging information. So if you damage your relationship with your allies, they are going to leak. And that's what then leads to scandals becoming exposed to the public. And it wasn't a coincidence that if you look at all Boris's wrongdoing, the kinds of things he had to cover up, overwhelmingly, most of them are about giving preference and favors or deals or contracts to friends, families, lovers, or his allies. So in a way, I'm trying to really make a very relational theory to explain what's missing in the common theories about what's going on when standards decline. And finally, I just want to say that it is interesting that scapegoating, this kind of blaming either of individuals or whole systems, often gets directed at times of crisis, I think even more so, to either the most powerful people in society or the least powerful. In a way, often it is the leader or the most vulnerable who get blamed for things. But my question is, yeah, but who else is involved in these breaches of standards? It's terribly tempting just to paint Boris Johnson as the villain. But actually, citizens have been involved in both my main stories, in the expenses scandal and in Boris's casual attitude towards ethics. Citizens were involved, academics were involved, and journalists were involved, directly or indirectly, either by what they said, but also what's more painful, because it really implies us something, a kind of tough challenge to us all. What about what you don't say? So for me, it's really significant to be talking about this today, because I don't normally speak that critically about Parliament, particularly, but even parliamentarians. Because after the expenses scandal, I felt that they were so relentlessly attacked all the time that a corrective was needed, that somebody needed to say, look, but actually some of what these politicians is doing is really, really honorable and really admirable, and they work really, really hard. But something happened with the systematic way for years that our Prime Minister, the most politically important person in the UK, acted with such disregard for standards, honour, loyalty, that from my point of view, the actions tipped over beyond a line where I started to write blogs, tweet, and now give papers about the problem that we have at this moment. Although we have a new Prime Minister from yesterday, so this moment is changing as I speak. But I'll finish there. Thank you so much.
Obrigada, professora Emma. Thank you. It was really enlightening for this day. E agora eu convido... Estou misturando português e inglês, tá? Vai ficar interessante isso aqui. Eu convido a professora Carla Teixeira, da UNB, coordenadora do LEIP, Laboratório de Etnografia das Instituições e Práticas de Poder, a se juntar conosco aqui na mesa. Obrigada, Carla, por aceitar nosso convite. E também convido a Telma Hoyler, pesquisadora, doutora em Ciência Política pela USP, integrante do nosso grupo de pesquisa, que veio nos acompanhar. Well, it was really enlightening, and I think we have a lot of different topics for debate. Mas vamos ouvir, então, as considerações da Carla, os comentários que você tiver, e eu vou traduzindo aqui ao mesmo tempo. Você vai fazer em inglês? Ah, ok. Tá bem. Obrigada.
Bom, boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon, everyone. I prepare a short text, so in this way I can be more objective and concise. It was with great pleasure that I received the invitation to comment on the working paper presented today by Emma. This is a thought-provoking reflection itself, but my view, when placed in contrast with the universe of Brazilian politics, more specifically National Congress, it acquires additional relevance. The potential to shed new light on Brazilian political dynamics and vice versa. I hope so. The question I will pose, therefore, will have this comparative perspective. But first, I would like to thank you, Emma, for sharing your reflection with us, and also to Cristiane for organizing this round table, and of course, for including me. Break the rules, or to put it more properly, behavior denounced as inappropriate in the Chamber of Deputies in Brazil has been, with greater or lesser emphasis over the time, my object of interest since the early 1990s. Shortly after the end of the military dictatorship, the accusation of embezzlement of resources from the budget became public. Deputies and senators in the Budget Committee would have used various maneuvers considered illicit to allocate resources for their own benefit. For example, using civil constructions companies, social institutions, etc. So a joint parliamentary inquiry commission was then installed to carry out the investigation. This commission focused the attention of everyone inside and outside the Congress. The investigation included the first disclosure of information of those hundreds of confidential bank and tax records, the authorization of dozens of phone taps, and 79 statements taken during more than 100 meetings. The Commission concluded in 1994 with the proposal for the impeachment of 18 parliamentarians and the submission of various dossiers for the Inland Revenue and the Public Prosecutor's Office to continue the investigations. I draw attention here to the regimental term used in this process, incompatibility with parliamentary decorum. That was the category. Reading the process and consulting the internal regulations of the House, I was able to map the symbolic field of decorum, that of dignity and honor. In other words, we were in the pure domain of morality. I say this not only because of the values evoked, but also because parliamentary decorum does not need to be typified as a crime. It's enough that it be politically constructed as such, different from the notion of crime of responsibility that guides the impeachment process of presidents and ministers in our country. Going a little deep, at the top of values relating to decorum were honesty and its opposite, corruption. At the time, illicit enrichment would be the inadmissible conduct, while other faults could be considered mere mistakes. And making mistake is human, as they said. We have then a mixture of interests, emotions, values, and classification of practices that during these impeachment rituals were handled through discourse of justification, excusing, and blaming, and presentation of supporting documents. All these in a game of accusation and defense that sometimes referred to the personal attributes of the deputies and senator, sometimes the violated institutional function. Emma has addressed scandals that seem to be on similar ground, entangling different expressions of moralities, interests, and knowledge. However, as she emphasized, in UK, the Constitution relies not in the written, codified, and documented set of principles and rules, but on custom, an institutional configuration quite different from ours. I imagine that these were moments of great tension, and I fully agree when you say, Emma, that, I open quotation mark now, the more serious the decision is viewed by those who control the rules, and the more it might be difficult to reach agreement, the more it tends to be ritualized. So it would be very interesting if you could tell us about how these political rituals took place inside Westminster, how MEPs handled the written and customary rules, rules of procedures and moralities, languages of accusation and defense, and what was the category or the principle that allowed to punish some of them in any of the cases you analyzed. I believe that understanding the ritualization in the British Parliament for dealing with serious misconduct can help us to better understand our own specificity. Another reflection that instigates me was when you highlighted here in the final the affinity between journalists and researchers in the approach on rule breaking in Parliament. Once again, I will quote you. To focus on individualism, find the culprits and punish them or not. To look at the system or culture, to identify faults with it, reform and enforce the rules. Here there is the same tendency, maybe with a little more emphasis in punishing individuals. However, what kept me wonder was how to deal with this continuity between common sense and scientific knowledge that this affinity reveals. I agree with you that these approaches are insufficient, and that is essential to consider the day-to-day practice and the network relationships that preceded the public denunciation of a behavior and its transformation into a scandal, including seeking to understand how and under what circumstances such everyday practices are transformed into serious breaches of rules. Lying, for example. Concealing, masking, or altering information are considered by common sense, but also by some social scientists, as a common practice by politicians in their negotiations, alliances, bargains, and bravado, and also to deny requests from voters without losing their votes. But in some contexts, such practices overflow these situations, become news, start to be called and denounced as lies, and to be investigated as serious faults. When this happens, it reinforces the discredit of politicians who, in turn, are quick to separate and punish the accused in order not to contaminate the image of politicians in general and of the institution itself. Considering this continuity, I asked him how we can contribute to epistemological debate on the construction of knowledge in political anthropology. Anthropology is a science that proposes that local knowledge, or common sense, challenge our concepts and advance our theories. What does this emphasis on the individual and institutional rules tell us about how people in general and some social scientists understand political life? You, Emma, rightly pointed to a separation between individual and society that would be at the root of these conceptions, and proposed to focus on the interactions that constitute individuals in society. Inspired by Eli as an author, I also value a lot. However, if the separation of individual and society runs through different dynamics of social life, what is the specificity of this duality when it concerns politicians and politics? I have no answer. It's not a rhetorical question. But I suggest that we take as our starting point that the very conception of political representation, remember Bourdieu, the representative is the individual who embodies and speaks for the group, but he's apart from the group. So political representation itself became possible only in the modern era. In this period, we observe the building of the nation states, the national states, the separation between states and society in Tim Mitchell's terms, and the emergence of mass democracies with the values of equality and the creation of these important professional and occasional politicians, as Weber analyzed. This is precisely the historical configuration in which the individual emerged as a major value and the rationality of rules. The institutions themselves became a utopia to be built. In other words, I propose that it would be the very domain of politics conceived and organized as if it were an autonomous space different from the market and surrounding society that would hold an intrinsic affinity with individualism and institutionalism. The same duality that guides explanations of breaking of rules and proposition of practical solutions or new standards. So perhaps this is why it's so difficult to think outside of this framework. What requires us to invest in its denaturalization to make it at least questionable. This denaturalization is difficult to do, and for this reason, I think that there is a risk of expanding this duality in time when we call attention to the connections between the denounced behavior and previous daily practice and relationship. That is important, but how to do that? I don't know. These are some ideas that return from time to time, and reading Emma's work made me take them up again with the expectation of being able to move ahead from our dialogue. A final question. In some political contexts, it is not easy to do participant observation because doors are closed and people don't want to talk with us, especially in tense situations mentioned here. So, another methodologies are necessary, and ethnography of documents acquires particular relevance. But how building the point of view of our subject of research in these circumstances? What documents allow us to do? That's it. Thanks a lot, Emma and Cristiane.
Wow. Just the only final question would be a topic for a book. Okay, so I thank you very much, Carla, for being with us and for your amazing questions. And now, Telma, you have the space for doing your comments and questions, and after this, Emma will answer, I hope, or not, to make more questions.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Good afternoon. Thank you. Is it on? Is it on? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor actually to share table with all of you. I've agreed previously with Emma that I would send my written comments so I can speak Portuguese more freely with you. So I'm gonna be keep to my script so she can trust that I'm actually speaking the same things. Ok. Então, eu pensei a minha fala aqui como pensando que seria mesmo uma plateia multidisciplinar, então que tópicos seriam interessantes para a gente, para estimular uma conversa, né? E aí eu pensei a estruturação em 3 questões que apareceram quando eu li o artigo da Emma. Um é a corrupção, então como um fato de uma construção social interdisciplinar e como pensar o nosso lugar na construção de escândalos. Um outro é pensar que noções de conhecimento a gente tem em cada uma das disciplinas e como crenças, fé, evidência ou opiniões estão relacionadas a como é a proposta dela para pensar o que é conhecimento, né, o termo knowledge, e pensar também sobre quando o wrongdoing não vira um escândalo, né? A gente viu aqui um caso de virar escândalo, mas a gente tem alguns exemplos de quando não vira, e também é interessante pensar nisso. Eu li, então, esse texto como um convite para pensar a produção de conhecimento interdisciplinar nas ciências sociais e profissões que diretamente afetam a política e as políticas, o que inclui também, eu estou incluindo aqui jornalistas e servidores e servidoras públicas. Eu acho que o artigo é muito certeiro ao mostrar esse enfoque que tem sido muito dual em termos das ferramentas disponíveis para compreender o que acontece quando se quebra uma regra, né? Como a Carla também ressaltou, tem um enfoque ou individual, então ou é moral, é um cálculo muito racional do indivíduo, ou então é institucional, e aí a gente vai pensar se as regras são suficientes para conter esse wrongdoing. E aí isso acaba colocando as pessoas como peças de uma engrenagem, né, que no máximo fazem alguns cálculos estratégicos para antecipar o comportamento do outro e agir estrategicamente de acordo com como acham que os outros vão se comportar. E aí a gente esquece de colocar as relações e as pessoas de volta na cena, né? E aí, como a Emma ressalta, os escândalos frequentemente assumem essa proporção como pessoas reagindo a outras pessoas. E eu acho esse caso dos escândalos dos gastos bastante interessante, porque ele coloca o escândalo, então, como um fato social. O artigo está propondo um modo de ler os acontecimentos políticos, né? Não a corrupção em si necessariamente, mas então a construção social que o envolve, e isso me parece uma oportunidade para a gente pensar juntos como todos nós participamos dessa cena. Como sociedade, mas também a partir das nossas profissões que estão situadas nessa sociedade, né? E como então a gente contribui para construir esse fato político e social. Nesse sentido, a primeira pergunta para a Emma seria, na verdade, para ela comentar um pouco mais sobre como foi para ela se perceber como partícipe da construção desse fato, não do escândalo em si, mas numa leitura a posteriori que saiu, né? Então, ela tinha esse incrível volume de materiais para analisar, portanto, é uma pesquisa lenta. E a pergunta, então, é se isso teve algum efeito na narrativa. No artigo, ela disse que seria necessariamente uma leitura impopular do escândalo, porque os jornalistas queriam, talvez, mais fogo no circo, os políticos queriam que se sentir defendidos, talvez, e seria necessariamente uma leitura impopular do escândalo. Então, que efeito que essa leitura posteriori teve na opinião pública ou na comunidade política? Minha pergunta vem de um interesse pela reflexividade da pesquisadora, claro, mas também de uma análise sobre o timing da política, né? Porque essa é uma análise a posteriori. E o timing na produção de escândalos, ele é bastante crucial para o escândalo aparecer ou não, né? Então, também uma pergunta sobre onde caberia uma pós-análise, talvez. Que espaço teria isso no mundo político, né? Talvez, inclusive, seja uma pergunta sobre como nós, cientistas e jornalistas, podemos colaborar, porque estamos submetidos a condições muito diferentes de produção de conhecimento, né? E aí, eu tenho uma certa... Espero não ser rasa nessa leitura, mas ia pensar um pouco a partir das nossas diferentes produções, nossas diferentes profissões, como a gente produziria um fato social, né? Pensando no timing. Então, jornalistas que estão submetidos a inúmeras condições que a gente pode pensar aqui, mas tem pouco tempo para verificar a informação, para refletir sobre ela, né? E aí tem também a questão da transparência. Parece que, ao tratar a corrupção no momento em que ela está acontecendo, a gente está sendo mais transparente, publicizando a informação, que, por vezes, é mesmo isso que acontece, mas em que medida que essa transparência também não acaba trazendo mais opacidade, na medida em que não é possível uma reflexão cautelosa e checagem de fontes, né? Então, simplificando muito, colocando os cientistas nessa equação. Cientistas políticos de onde eu venho, então eu me sinto confortável em falar um pouco da nossa... Talvez eu tenha sido chamada aqui para defender os cientistas políticos, eu não farei isso. Então, em muitos casos, a gente produz uma investigação, uma pesquisa, considerando não o que mas o que devia ser, normativamente orientado, sem perceber, sem dar conta dessa normatividade de fundo, né? E isso acaba influenciando as regras reais do jogo. Porque essas conclusões, enfim, vão ser disputadas em comunidades epistêmicas e elas têm efeito no mundo, sobre o que então a gente espera, como a gente espera que a política funcione ou não. E o que a gente vê, em alguns casos, é uma desconexão entre a regra e o que está, de fato, acontecendo. Isso produz uma irregularidade sistêmica, porque algumas atividades e práticas do mundo político, elas acabam sendo colocadas na ilegalidade. Eu vou dar um exemplo da minha própria pesquisa de doutorado, que são as rachadinhas. Eu estudei trabalho territorial de vereadores na cidade de São Paulo, né? E eu encontrei que, de modo sistemático, mas isso vale também para deputados, de modo sistemático existe uma distribuição informal do recurso total que um gabinete deve receber pelo menos na cidade de São Paulo, eu sei que em BH é assim também, existem categorias de assessores, mas essas categorias são definidas, no caso de São Paulo, foram definidas pelo Ministério Público, respondendo ao anseio de alguns pesquisadores que queriam, então, dizer como que a coisa devia ser, e essas categorias não correspondem ao que eles precisam para fazer a política acontecer. Resultado disso é que, como é muito caro fazer política, e como no caso dos escândalos também existe uma incompreensão, talvez, da opinião pública e da sociedade sobre como é caro fazer política, esse assunto não é levado a debate público como mereceria. Então, essa irregularidade sistêmica de uma divisão informal, eu não estou falando aqui de colocar laranjas, e nem que seria colocar alguém que só vai receber e não vai trabalhar. Estou falando de um outro lugar, talvez, no espectro, né, do que a gente conhece como rachadinha, que seria apenas uma divisão irregular das rubricas internamente ao gabinete, para que se possa acessar territórios e chamar mais assessores para fazer o trabalho. Acaba que, como isso é uma coisa, digamos, impopular, não se promove um debate público qualificado sobre, né? Porque os políticos prevêem que os eleitores e a opinião pública não vão concordar, né, com isso. E aí, então, o funcionamento real do sistema político não bate com as regras e a gente fica um pouco nessa confusão, né? E aí, claro que vão sempre surgir casos de corrupção, porque a gente está falando de regras desenhadas com um certo distanciamento do mundo empírico, assim, né? E aí, corrupção vira um trending topics, como um tema bastante usado pela imprensa para produzir engajamento, e pelos próprios políticos, para falar dos opositores, né? Nunca sobre si mesmo. E aí, na minha impressão, tem uma certa desengajamento da política, em certo sentido, no sentido de que as questões mais substantivas acabam sendo menos discutidas, porque a gente, então, está muito preso a essas irregularidades sistêmicas, né? A produção do conhecimento sobre como a política acontece, então, se dá nesse processo complexo e que se torna gradativamente difícil de distinguir o que é o quê. Porque se um político está falando que o outro é corrupto, no meio disso tem fake news, no meio disso tem esse espectro de práticas irregulares sistêmicas que a gente precisa, então, cada um vai afinar um pouco, tentar afinar para o seu lado, né? Mas isso é completamente irregular, isso é como que a Emma trouxe no caso dela? Ela trouxe um exemplo sobre uma compreensão muito fina se seria permitido ou não. Bom, talvez eu me lembre até o final da... Mas, então, no meio dessas pequenas torções, cálculos, emoções, o fato social vai sendo construído e a gente já não consegue ter esse distanciamento engajado para conseguir entender o que está acontecendo e como ele foi produzido, né? Isso traz de volta ao ponto de que a gente precisa refletir sobre a nossa própria forma de conhecer as coisas. E é uma provocação também para pensar como estimular esse debate público, como a gente entende, com alguma suspensão, as coisas, com alguma suspensão e estando situado, né? Para quem está acostumado ao debate da antropologia, é comum pensar no termo tá situado, né? Que a gente pensa como minha identidade de gênero, como a minha raça, como a minha classe social, o meu background vai influenciar como a gente está vendo as coisas. Mas a proposta de análise de como é produzir conhecimento que a Emma traz, eu acho que vai um pouco além disso. Ela implica pensar em como nós, seres políticos, estamos produzindo esse conhecimento coletivamente. Sim. Então, estar situado é estar dentro, assim, é participar como atores políticos na construção de narrativas, né? Bom, e aí pensar como a gente está situado, então faz toda a diferença no uso que acho que as nossas pesquisas podem ter para o mundo. Isso vale para pensar a ciência, para pensar o jornalismo, para pensar também servidores públicos, porque requer bastante análise, né, no cotidiano. Eu estudei na minha tese, então, o trabalho territorial de vereadores, como eu falei, e um professor bastante conhecido da ciência política me perguntou por que eu faria entrevistas, já que políticos mentem. E aí, essa frase é tão boa que eu me pego cada vez explorando um aspecto dela, assim, né? E me tocou hoje pensar sobre o oposto. E se eles não mentissem? O que seria o caso? Acreditar em tudo o que dizem, né? Que noções de verdade isso carrega, de que é uma verdade fora da gente, né? Fora daquela que, como sociedade, somos capazes de produzir. E como temos produzido, então, essa verdade, esse conhecimento conjuntamente. E aí, eu queria provocar a Emma a pensar um pouco, a falar um pouco mais sobre essa ideia de conhecimento que ela traz. Eu vou ler um trecho do artigo, eu não sei quem teve, se circulou, quem teve oportunidade de ler. Então, ela faz uma distinção entre crença e conhecimento. E aí eu queria pedir um pouco para ela falar mais sobre a relação entre verdade, crenças, opiniões e conhecimentos. O trecho é o seguinte: We need to explain how and why people's beliefs change. Although anthropologists prefer the more neutral concept of knowledge to belief, in the sense of what we think we know about the world, the implication is that belief is something someone has. Knowledge production is a process we are all engaged in. I realize knowledge raises another problem. If contested and plural, then how can different kinds of knowledge coexist? And how does the knowledge of the research impacts the inquiry? So então, é um pouco para pensar essas distinções um pouco mais, porque me parece ainda que tem um proveito em tratar essas questões crença e conhecimento como separadas, né? O que a gente produz conjuntamente com o que a gente aporta ao espaço público é uma coisa que eu estou entendendo como essa produção do conhecimento. Mas o que a gente aporta vem de lugares muito distintos. Vem de fé, vem de crenças, vem de opiniões, de evidências, né? Cada uma dessas coisas podem ser hierarquizadas de um modo diferente por pessoas diferentes. Então, para alguém que participa na política porque tem fé, pedir evidências pode ser considerado rude, até a promoção da desarmonia. A gente falou sobre nessa semana de alguém que, em um grupo de WhatsApp, foi excluído porque pediu evidência de onde vinha uma notícia. Já para alguém que participa desse espaço público, considerando que na política é possível encontrar diferentes formas de dialogar, né, circunscritos por certas regras que permitem o convívio, o conhecimento na ausência de evidências pode ser o que, na verdade, desestabiliza isso. Então, me parece que esses elementos todos olhados separadamente ainda têm uma função analítica, assim, para entender a produção do conhecimento conjunto. Então, eu pedi a Emma para falar um pouco mais sobre a relação entre essas coisas. E, por fim, quando as coisas não aparecem, né? Fiquei pensando no oposto dos escândalos, porque tantas coisas não se tornam. Em que situações o descumprimento é aceito, seja entre políticos, seja da sociedade para os políticos, seja também dos políticos para a sociedade, né? Tem algo quando se entra numa instituição, numa organização, que é a produção de uma certa reciprocidade na diferença, né? Para que principalmente onde decisões precisam ser tomadas com uma velocidade, como é no caso de câmaras do Congresso, é preciso que um não fique bloqueando o jogo do outro o tempo inteiro para que um jogo mínimo possa acontecer. Ainda assim, existem rupturas. Como que a gente pensa essas rupturas, né? E como que essas rupturas que acontecem no interior dessas organizações têm relação com, talvez, um mood da sociedade, a gente pode chamar, com o que está acontecendo fora dela. São essas minhas questões. I promised I was strict to the script.
Elas combinaram antes, gente, não vale. Não, vale, né? So, you have your time to address the questions, comments, beliefs, knowledge, true, I don't know, whatever.
Thank you so much. Is that working? Yeah? Yeah, I can't do justice to those fabulous comments and questions, but I'm going to take them away because, as Carla said, this is a work in progress, so that's incredibly helpful for the next iteration. And if I may, I'll send you the next iteration and you can see what you think. But I'll just make a few remarks because I'd also really love to hear what other people think. So just to answer the question about what happens in Britain when there's an allegation of wrongdoing. First of all, everyone is very clear that allegations can be sometimes malicious because in the political game, it's not only politicians who throw allegations at each other, they're often have very close relationships with particular journalists who get involved in the political game. So of course that has to be taken into account. But I think the situation's a bit different, partly because politicians will be investigated if there's any allegation of crime, for example. So in fact, Boris was investigated by the police and he was found to have broken the law. And it was quite interesting to see how people reacted to that and whether or not he would resign. And he didn't resign over that. So it was like a bylaw. It wasn't a sort of major law, but nonetheless, he was found to have broken the law. So the first thing is you can be investigated by the police. No one is above the law, even if you're Prime Minister. But if you've broken not the law, but you've broken a parliamentary rule, then there are two main courses. If the rule is a rule in one of the parliamentary rituals, then obviously the Speaker decides what to do and might throw you out of the chamber or whatever. But if it's the kind of wrongdoing that's to do with standards or privileges, as they call it, then there are two committees. It was one, but now it's two committees. One on standards and one on privileges. And interestingly, now we have members of the public, lay members we call them, who sit on those committees. And on the whole, there are very, very lengthy inquiries that do happen. And politicians are sometimes found to have breached in some way, and they will be punished or even kind of exiled, if you like. But on the whole, they're not really questioned. So these committees still remain serious, taken seriously, and on the whole, politicians don't question those processes. Because that's when politics gets really, really dangerous, when people start questioning processes, like the process of a Committee of Standards inquiry, or the result of an election, or whatever. So most politicians do understand that. But relating to your point, Carla, about different types of lying, which I think I need to think a lot more about, I was really interested to read a book by David Runciman about political hypocrisy, making a distinction, even though he wrote the book quite a while ago, but it's become even more relevant. He makes the distinction between the kind of inevitable compromises in politics that mean people are going to spin and create messages which are partly about timing. So, you know, you make an agreement and within some private group, political party or faction, and you can't tell the whole truth to the public at that moment, maybe you can later. These kinds of difficult political compromises that have to be made surely have to be tolerated, and actually the public should have, in a way, a greater understanding of how politics, even in organizations that we all work in, does kind of require of us these difficult kind of senses of uncomfortable compromises with telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth at any one time. A form of lying. But that's very different from saying that you're above that kind of politics. You're not doing politics. And that, in a way, you are never deceitful and you're never lying. And in a way, that's a much, much more dangerous kind of lie. And that's the kind of, in a way, that's the kind of position I think that Trump has, that he's saying, no, I'm not really a politician, and therefore, in a way, anything you say that's challenging me is fake news. And Boris was sometimes like that, but he had kind of two modes. His other mode was to crack jokes and embark on sort of humor to evade the sort of accusation of lying. So there are different modes. But I think what you've challenged me with this duality. So coming to that point, the duality about individuals and systems, and I think you're right. I think I need to think a bit more carefully, because in a way, I think I've got caught up with the way that my informants think, and I've sometimes kind of lied it into using it myself. And when I've written about politics in other books, I've really paid much more attention to processes. So I got really, really interested in trying to understand political work as a series of processes that are the kind of continuities that politicians in different configurations, so in a way getting away from thinking of them as either individuals or part of a system, but thinking about the interaction that creates certain kinds of processes, like, for example, rhythms of work. So the rhythms that politicians create in time and space, in a way gets you away from that kind of duality. But I think I've defaulted back a little bit in this particular paper, so I think I need to go away and think about that again. So thanks for that. And finally, on Carla's points about methodology, I absolutely agree. We really have to be creative about the different ways that we study parliaments, whether it's through text, whether it's through watching the TV. But it is very difficult, I think, to really understand what's going on unless you are embedded. And of course, that's really hard. It's hard to get permission to get embedded. But once you're there, it is hard not to develop what my brother-in-law accuses me of, which is Stockholm syndrome, because he says I've become too sympathetic. But I did manage, when the House of Commons institutionalized a kind of academics fellowship, and I think this was a brilliant innovation. So every year there are fellowships which give, and you competitively apply, up to, let's say, 10 academics can be embedded for a period of time. They have to come up with a good proposal. And when colleagues, parliamentary officials, were showing me all the documentation, there was a little clause that said, and you should come up with findings that are favorable to Parliament. And I said, no way. You cannot compromise academic integrity in that way. You have to let them, show that you're ready for for criticism by outsiders. In a way that implies that you're self-critical. That's a very grown-up position. So have the confidence. And of course, the parliamentary officials totally got that. So they fortunately took out that clause. And I want to come finally quickly to Telma's comments. And I've cheated a little bit here, actually, because I'm sorry, I didn't even realize I was doing this, Telma, but because we already collaborate, I realized that you've already influenced me in the way that I iterated the speech since I wrote the paper. And I didn't even realize I was doing that. So, in fact, I've already, in a way, tried to reflect on some of your comments. So, I think I mentioned one of Telma's comments was about my role in constructing the narrative. And I didn't actually put this in the paper, but when I was talking to you, I was trying to explain how the first study I did was after the expenses scandal, and in a way it was a very sympathetic account of politicians. And maybe in a way I contributed to a kind of silence around this whole expenses scandal at that time, which I then felt I needed to correct, which is, as I explained, partly why I did this book. So I think it is a really, really good question to any scholar. You know, what contribution are you making to the narratives that are going on now? What impact are you having? And as I also explained in the paper, I am now trying to be as vocal as I dare about the Prime Minister. Of course, it's a lot easier now, by the Prime Minister who's just left. So it did occur to me that it could make it very difficult. No one would stop me going into Parliament, but it could have been the case that any of his allies refused to speak to me as a parliamentary researcher. And I thought, well, that's a price I have to pay. I will go and study something else for a while until things move on. And now I've got so old, I know they do move on. But sometimes I think you have to be prepared to make sacrifices in order to try and retain kind of honor and integrity yourself. Telma made some really, really interesting challenges about how we think about belief versus knowledge. I don't think I'm right if I imply that knowledge is a more neutral term, so I think I need to have another look at that. But I do think that by talking about informants' knowledge, you are reducing the distance between yourself and others. So in a sense, when you talk about belief, you're either talking about values, or you're implying you don't agree with what they're saying. And it's that latter category which makes me really, not me, anthropologists, very nervous. But I think you've given me something to think about in the way that I conceive of knowledge and this difficult challenge of how it is that you develop a certain degree of certainty about the way that you've interpreted these plural views and these multiple, often conflicting bodies of knowledge created by different individuals and groups and so forth. And I think I need to articulate that a bit better. And finally, why does a scandal become a scandal rather than a hidden process of wrongdoing? And I think what I'm trying to argue is that if you look at the relationships, you can discern why it is that things come out in the open. And I think I gave an example of the most dangerous thing politicians can do is to really alienate and betray their allies, because, as you know, leaking has become a kind of endemic process certainly in UK politics. A lot of news is essentially now about leaking. So, you know, if you can minimize the leaks from your own side, then you're likely to avoid a scandal. But there are many more aspects to that which I don't have time to dwell on. So I want to leave you time to respond. Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. Eu pergunto se alguma de vocês gostaria de uma tréplica, uma réplica, algum comentário adicional antes de passarmos às perguntas do público. Ok. Temos uma pergunta aqui, ela foi feita em inglês, eu vou ler. Pergunta do nosso colega Fabiano Schwartz, professor dos cursos de pós-graduação, coordenador da nossa pós-graduação. Ele diz: Emma, congratulations for your research and presentation. You left us a question at the end of your talk about who else is involved, directly or not, by action or inaction. Então, quem mais se envolve, né, diretamente ou não, por ação ou inação, no caso dos escândalos. Do you believe that this veiled involvement of other people in the breach or motivation for fake news spreading, and how it was frequent during expenses scandal?
Yeah, I mean, I should acknowledge that the extent to which it is possible to expose wrongdoing is very, very, very different in different countries. I'm in a way, when I'm talking to other academics in the UK or our kind of sister knowledge or news produces journalists. I'm saying actually the UK is a place where it is possible to call out wrongdoing. That's not necessarily true in other countries, so I don't want to imply this is an easy thing to do everywhere. Certainly, I know Ethiopia quite well, and it can be very dangerous in certain contexts to do so. The business about fake news, I think, is a really, really important role for scholars and for journalists. Maybe this has become, you know, a significant part of our work, because in a way we do have often a partiality, but I think as scholars of politics we have to have enough detachment from politics to be clear that we have a function that is not about simply promoting our own political causes, if you like. And that's where trying to really interrogate and explain to people what is the basis and the source of knowledge, and testing that to destruction is something extremely important for both scholars and journalists and other commentators to do. And I would say there was a real failure of that, actually, during the expenses scandal. It was really difficult for anyone to be honest about how the generalizations about wrongdoing about politicians was difficult to counter. Partly, it was actually quite difficult to know. The documents were like millions and millions of little pieces of information, so it was very difficult for people other than the journalists. The original journalists did a quite good job, but it was the subsequent journalists who then did a pile-on and produced endless stories where they picked up on little pieces of information and twisted it and got things wrong. Actually, it was journalists who produced fake news, and I think scholars should have done a better job at the time of calling them out. So there was a bit of a failure there, I would say.
It's okay. I'm seeing that people are writing. Other questions? Do you have more questions? There's another question there. Please. Enviem suas perguntas para este guichê. Victor Dalton, our student from the master, tudo bom, Victor? Is asking, you described House of Lords as easy to study and House of Commons as chaotic. In Brazil, you have 513 representatives in Chamber of Deputies. In surveys, people don't seem to trust them, but it's always common that people doesn't remember who they voted for in the last election. Do you think a big number of representatives makes hard for population to supervise their lawmakers?
That's an interesting question. I should be clear that when I say chaotic, I don't actually mean badly organized, because in fact the House of Commons is very, very beautifully managed by the administration. So actually the processes are surprisingly kind of seamless. You know, the rituals. In a way, the UK is really struggling in all kinds of ways, but we are very good at running rituals, if you like. So in some ways, the rituals are quite impressive. But the chaos is caused by the fact that you've got, yes, a large number of MPs, and I think to some extent you're right, the larger the number, the more complex it gets, running in all kinds of different directions, doing all kinds of different functions, some of which people don't really notice. And it's quite difficult at any one moment to know what is the most important thing that's happening at that time. So I suppose you're right that you know, the more of them there are, and then they have all their staff and they have all their journalists who they're talking to, and they're connected to civil society and lobby groups and companies or whatever, the more it is difficult to make sense of what's going on. But I'm not sure that the public really need to. So I don't personally think that reducing the number of MPs in the UK is necessary in order to explain politics better. I think politics could be explained better in public forums, like in interviews between journalists and politicians, on politicians' websites, by people like us, scholars. You know, I think we could do a better job of explaining what the kind of everyday business of politics actually entails, trying as hard as we can not to only do it from an extremely politically partial point of view, but explaining the kind of processes with a bit of detachment. So for me in the UK, I can't speak about Brazil. In the UK, I would say that's more important than reducing the number of MPs. In the House of Lords, on the other hand, there are so many of them because the Prime Minister can just keep creating them. They're appointed. So we have so many, they can't fit into the chamber. I mean, it's over 1,000. It's completely absurd. And the reason, you can imagine, the reason why it's tempting to keep appointing them is if you appoint them into your own party, then you get closer to having a majority. Nobody has an overall majority in the House of Lords. But it is a kind of scandal that there are so many members in the House of Lords. So, yeah, that's where the numbers need to be reduced.
Obrigada. Uma outra pergunta. Vou ler em português e depois a gente traduz para você. Ao apontar a importância das relações e interações, o seu destaque se refere a interações entre humanos ou inclui interações humanos e não humanos? Qual a importância desses outros atores para o processo? So, when you point to the importance of relationship and interaction, you are pointing just for interaction between humans, or are you including interactions between humans and non-humans? And what's the importance of these other actors for the process, the political process? I think the question is from Tiago. He didn't sign, but I saw.
So, I mean, yeah, I think this is probably, I have certain areas, I have to confess, which I have not thought enough about, and I should, because I've been insanely ambitious in my studies of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, because I was the first anthropologist in the UK to do so. But of course, you know, to study Parliament means to kind of study the whole nation. So I'm trying to find an excuse for the fact that I haven't really thought enough about non-humans. I haven't really thought enough about, for example, technology. I mean, there's very not only social media and the kind of technology that's involved there, but there's all kinds of technologies that are involved in rituals, obviously particularly voting. And actually, they are really, really important to making sure that those rituals are credible. So there are inanimate objects, if you like, that are very, very important to making things work in politics. But I think I could pay more attention to that. So yes, I think if you bring in objects or other non-humans like animals or whatever, then I think to be interesting about that, you would definitely need to look at the relationships between how they're used in things like the rituals, how they affect the rhythms of work. But I have to come back to you in a few more years with more significant things to say about that.
Another question from Fernanda Brito Lopes. Thank you, Fernanda, for the question. In your observations, what would be the biggest influences in the voting of new norms, new rules? Do you mean internal norms or internal rules or laws? Laws in general. Public policy, yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, okay, fine. Yes, okay, that's a it's a really good and really complicated question, because, you know, again, for me, that is begging a question about the nature of the relationship between these representatives and these others are immensely complicated because they're increasingly listening to their constituents, but then which constituents? So one of the questions I'm always really interested to find out from MPs is, well, who exactly are you listening to? And how are you listening to them? And how are they communicating with you? And of course, you're right, it becomes particularly interesting if they've got a bill under consideration. And it's really, really difficult to answer that question, but there are some patterns that you could see. So on the whole, for example, in the Conservative Party, there's a much bigger range of people, some of whom will engage and consult with their constituents on those kinds of policy matters, not only to answer individual problems in surgery meetings, they're called, but there will be other people who will take a more kind of Burkean view of representation and say, no, actually that kind of engagement and consultation is not necessary because I've been elected because I've got judgment. And then they would be more reliant on these other forms of consultation, which are partly done by government, but also done by Parliament and also done by individual MPs or groups, which is with sections of the society who are particularly affected by law. So if I could give the example of the clause that I followed, that 250 words, if you look at the legal texts, the parliamentary texts, it looks like there was a person in the House of Lords who was a judge who had the most impact because she introduced a very important amendment. But actually that amendment came from a children's charity originally, and that was produced by a whole coalition of lawyers, magistrates, children's guardians, social workers, all kinds of people who wanted to protect children. They took it to the opposition party, but in the House of Commons, the government will never accept an amendment from the opposition party because that's losing face. So if they can avoid it, they won't accept it. So then it goes to the House of Lords, and then the best tactic is to have a crossbencher who doesn't belong to any party, and that person introduces it, and they say, you know, on the basis of evidence, you know, please accept our amendment, and then the government can more easily accept it because it doesn't come from the opposition. So that's just 250 words. I could tell you a million different stories about the complex way that people influence bills, but they even will have an influence in what comes to Parliament. So there are now petitions, for example, that are gaining a little bit more influence. Very occasionally they will lead to civil servants creating some bill. It's much more difficult for individual MPs, private members' bills to pass, but even occasionally they do, and they've normally come out of conversations with the public. So I would say that engagement has gone from minimal 100 years ago to actually really, really, really so intense now that it's quite difficult to map it all. But fortunately, one of our colleagues, Cristina Lestan-Bandera, is mapping it, so I really recommend going to her work because she's one of the world's experts on engagement and including what impact that has on lawmaking. Yeah.
Ok. Mais questões? Alguma outra pergunta, gente? Não? Eu gostaria de agradecer. I will translate for you, no, don't worry, but it's not any other question. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos, as perguntas. Gostaria de agradecer muito as nossas duas debatedoras pelas perguntas, pelos comentários, Telma e Carla. Muito obrigada por estarem aqui conosco. E, obviamente, gostaria de agradecer demais a professora Emma por ter aceitado o convite. E só para a gente pensar, né, como essas reflexões dialogam profundamente com aquilo que a gente vem estudando no curso de mestrado, especificamente, né, com os objetos de pesquisa dos alunos, com as reflexões que a gente tem feito lá no laboratório de etnografia das instituições, né, Carla? Coisas que a gente vem refletindo nesse período e agora inclusive, né, alguns dos meus alunos estão aqui, claro, porque eu obriguei, né, para fazer a plateia, e eles já estão me mandando mensagem, né, me manda o artigo da Emma e tal, então, né, eu sei que o assunto é interessante. Espero que todos tenham aproveitado, agradeço a presença de todos e aguardamos vocês nas próximas palestras do nosso ciclo de palestras da nossa coordenação de pós-graduação, premiadíssima, super respeitada, né? Quase, daqui a pouco nós vamos divulgar os resultados das avaliações aí, né? Ainda não, me disseram que eu não posso, mas enfim, né? Tá tudo certo. Olha aí, o pessoal já está dizendo que a gente pode ou não pode? Pode. Não, não vou dizer aqui, porque depois vai ficar gravado, vão me acusar, e eu que vou ser exonerada, não pode, então eu não disse, é segredo de Estado. Obrigada, gente, boa tarde e até mais.